Welcome to Hearths of Myths. Today, the heavens darken, and the air crackles with ozone. We are ascending the throne of the King of Gods, Zeus. Close your eyes, settle in, and let the storm begin. In the beginning, before the golden halls of Olympus pierced the clouds, and before the order of the seasons dictated the rhythm of mortal life, there was a cosmos governed by the raw, unbridled violence of creation. The universe did not begin with a gentle awakening, but with a scream, the tearing apart of earth and sky. To understand the Father of gods and men, one must first understand the darkness from which he was born, and the terrifying lineage that sought to strangle his light before it could ever spark. The story of Zeus begins not with his birth, but with the fear of his father, Kronos. Kronos, the youngest of the Titans, the crooked counselor, sat upon the throne of the universe, a usurper king whose hands were stained with the ichor of his own father, Uranos. The sky had been separated from the earth, castrated by the jagged flint sickle held in Kronos' hand. And in that act of primal violence, a curse was spoken. As Uranos fled into the upper ethers, bleeding stars into the void, he prophesied that Kronos too would fall. He whispered that the king of Titans would be overthrown by his own blood, just as he had overthrown his sire. This prophecy was a cold iron seed planted in the mind of Kronos. It took root deep within his immortal soul, twisting his thoughts into a labyrinth of paranoia. He ruled over the Golden Age, a time when the earth yielded fruit without toil, and spring was eternal. But for the king himself, there was no peace. He looked at his queen, his sister wife Rhea, not with love, but with suspicion. He watched her belly, waiting for the swell of life, not to celebrate a successor, but to identify a threat. The tragedy began with Hestia. When Rhea brought forth their first child, a daughter of pure hearth fire and grace, she presented the infant to Kronos, expecting the pride of a father. Instead, she saw the widening of his dark eyes, the flaring of his nostrils as he smelled the destiny clinging to the child. He did not cradle Hestia. He opened his maw, a cavern of god-flesh and darkness, and he swallowed her whole. There was no chewing, no bloodshed, only the terrifying, unnatural gulp of a god consuming a god. Hestia vanished into the damp, lightless prison of his stomach, alive, immortal, and trapped. Rhea stood frozen, her grief turning to a stone in her chest. But the horror was only beginning. Year after year, century after century, the cycle repeated. Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, with hair like ripened wheat and eyes green as the first sprout, swallowed. Hera, the queenly majesty, born with a crown of invisible gold upon her brow, swallowed. Hades, the unseen one, silent and brooding, swallowed. Poseidon, carrying the scent of the deep oceans and the rumble of earthquakes, swallowed. 5 children, 5 gods, all imprisoned within the living dungeon of their father's gut. Kronos grew bloated with his own kin, a monstrous vessel of divine potential, suppressing the future of the cosmos within his own ribcage. He sat upon his throne on Mount Olympus, the black mountain of the Titans, believing he had cheated fate. He believed he had digested the prophecy. But fate is not so easily consumed. Rhea, the mother of gods, was drowning in sorrow. She was the earth itself, fertile and giving. Yet she was forced to watch her harvest destroyed by the reaper she had wed. When she felt the sixth child stirring within her, a presence stronger, brighter, and more turbulent than any before, she knew she could not let this one perish. This child kicked with the force of a thunderclap. His heartbeat was the rhythm of a storm. This was Zeus. Desperation sharpened Rhea's mind. She sought the counsel of the oldest powers, Gaia, Earth, and Uranos, Sky, asking for a way to hide this final child from the gluttonous hunger of Kronos. They whispered to her through the rustling of ancient oaks and the shifting of tectonic plates. They told her of an island, a place of deep caves and thick forests, a cradle far from the gaze of Othrys. When the labor pains began, Rhea did not retreat to her usual chambers. Under the cover of a moonless night, where the shadows of the Titans could not track her, she fled across the wine-dark sea to the island of Crete. The winds aided her, hushing their howling so as not to alert the king. The waves smoothed their crests to carry her swiftly. She arrived at the mountain of Dictae, some say Aegeon, a rugged peak piercing the Cretan sky. There, in the depths of a sacred cave, hidden behind curtains of ivy and moss, Rhea crouched upon the earth and gave birth to her youngest son. Zeus entered the world not with a cry of distress, but with a gaze of awareness. Even as an infant, his skin hummed with static energy. The air in the cave grew thin and sharp, smelling of ozone. He was small, vulnerable, yet undeniably potent. Rhea held him for only a moment, pressing her lips to his forehead, weeping tears of both joy and terror. She knew she could not keep him. To keep him was to kill him. She handed the infant to the earth itself, to Gaia, to be hidden. Then she prepared the great deception. Rhea returned to Mount Othrys, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She needed a decoy. She went to the riverbanks and found a stone, a great, smooth omphalos stone, heavy and cold. It was roughly the size of a swaddled infant. With trembling hands, she wrapped the rock in layers of golden cloth, the swaddling bands of a divine prince. She bundled it carefully, hiding the gray, unyielding surface beneath the soft fabrics. She approached the throne of Kronos. The Titan king looked down, his eyes narrowing. "You have birthed another," he rumbled, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. "Give it to me." Rhea stepped forward, feigning the submission of a dutiful wife, though every instinct screamed at her to strike him. She held out the bundle. "A son," she whispered, her voice cracking with a perfectly feigned sorrow. "Your son." Kronos did not hesitate. He did not check the face of the child. He did not feel for a heartbeat. His arrogance had made him sloppy. His paranoia had made him blind to the possibility of betrayal from his broken wife. He snatched the bundle from her arms. He opened his great jaws, unhinging them like a serpent, and thrust the stone wrapped in cloth into his throat. He swallowed. The stone slid down his gullet, heavy and scraping, settling into the pit of his stomach alongside the 5 living children. Kronos rubbed his belly, satisfied by the weight. He felt the heaviness and assumed it was the child. "It is done," he declared, leaning back onto his obsidian throne. The prophecy is broken. I am eternal. But he was wrong. The stone sat inert in his gut, a silent mock. And far away, across the churning seas, deep within the Dictaean Cave, the true king of the gods drew his first breaths of freedom. The storm had not been swallowed. The storm was rising. The island of Crete became the nursery of the storm. While Kronos slumbered in his arrogance on Mount Olympus, believing his throne secure, the child Zeus was growing in the verdant shadows of Mount Ida. The world was divided in two. The upper world of Titanic tyranny, gray and oppressive, and the hidden pocket of vibrant life within the cave, where the future was being forged. The upbringing of Zeus is a testament to the collaboration of nature itself against the unnatural order of the Titans. He was not raised by his mother Rhea, for she had to return to Olympus to maintain the ruse. Instead, the infant god was fostered by the daughters of the earth and the spirits of the wild. The cave was a cathedral of stalactites and damp stone, cool and echoing. It was here that the nymphs, Adrastea and Ida, took charge of the divine infant. They were gentle creatures of the mountain, their hands accustomed to the rough bark of pines and the soft fur of wolves. They wove a cradle of gold and suspended it from the branch of a great tree, so that Zeus would rest neither on the earth, nor in the sea, nor in the sky, technically existing in no domain that Kronos ruled. He hung between the worlds, invisible to the all-seeing eyes of his father. But a god-child is not a silent thing. When Zeus cried, his voice was not a whimper. It was a boom that threatened to shake the very rocks of the mountain, a cry that loud would surely carry across the winds to Olympus. To mask this sound, Rhea had stationed guardians at the mouth of the cave, the Korates. The Korates were earth-born warriors, spirits of the dance and the blade. They stood guard in full bronze armor, their helmets gleaming in the dappled sunlight. Whenever the infant Zeus filled his lungs to scream, whether in hunger or in the frustration of his budding power, the Korates would begin their wild, cacophonous dance. They stomped their feet until the ground drummed. They clashed their spears against their shields in a rhythmic, metallic frenzy. Clang, clang, boom. The noise was deafening, a wall of industrial sound that swallowed the cries of the baby. To any listener from afar, it sounded only like the rumblings of the earth or the chaotic storms of the mountains. They beat their shields to hide the thunder, protecting the god of sound with sound itself. Sustenance for the future king did not come from a mortal breast. Zeus was wet-nursed by the divine goat, Amalthea. She was no ordinary beast. Her horns curved like the crescent moon, and her fleece was as white as the clouds that gathered at the peaks. Her milk was rich and sweet, imbued with the strength of the wild earth. It is said that in his play, the young Zeus, not yet knowing his own strength, grasped one of Amalthea's horns and snapped it from her head. To comfort the beast, he blessed the horn, promising that it would forever be filled with whatever its possessor desired, the cornucopia, the horn of plenty. Even in his youth, Zeus was a giver of laws and a bender of reality. He fed also on honey. The bees of the mountain, the Melissa, were his servants. They distilled the nectar of the rarest mountain flowers, feeding the golden ambrosia directly to the god's lips. This diet of goat's milk and wild honey, of earth and flower, knit together his bones with the density of diamonds, and filled his veins with ichor that burned like liquid fire. As the years passed, years that moved differently for a god than for mortals, Zeus shed his infancy. He grew with terrifying speed. He roamed the forests of Crete, his feet hardening on the stones, his muscles knotting like the roots of the ancient oaks. He was not merely strong, he was intelligent. He possessed métis, cunning, wisdom, the ability to see the weave of the world. He spent his days wrestling with lions and racing the winds, but he also spent long hours in silence, sitting on the highest peaks of the Idaean range, looking north toward the brooding silhouette of Mount Olympus. He could feel the oppression in the air. He could feel the stagnation of the golden age under Kronos, a perfection that was rotting from the inside. He saw mortals living in a stupor, without fire, without challenge, existing merely as pets of the Titans. He felt the absence of his siblings, a phantom ache in his blood. He knew they were out there, or rather in there, trapped in the gullet of the king. It was during these adolescence years that Zeus began to discover the specific nature of his power. It happened first during a summer squall. As rain lashed the mountain, Zeus did not seek shelter. He stood on a precipice, arms spread, shouting into the gale. And the gale shouted back. He felt a tether connecting his will to the clouds. He focused, his eyes turning a blinding white, and for the first time, the sky obeyed. A jagged spear of pure light coalesced in his hand, intangible, burning, humming with the sound of 1,000,000,000 bees. The first lightning bolt. It was unstable, flickering out in a second, but the heat of it lingered on his palm. He realized then that he was not just a god of strength like the earthborn, nor a god of the void like his ancestors. He was the king of the atmosphere, the lord of the high air. He held the weapon that strikes from above. He was visited often by his grandmother, Gaia. The Earth Mother was old and tired of the tyranny of Kronos, just as she had been tired of Uranos. She taught Zeus the history of his bloodline. She told him of the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires, monstrous uncles of Zeus, children of Gaia whom Kronos had imprisoned in Tartarus because their ugliness offended him. "If you are to defeat your father," Gaia whispered, her voice the rustle of dry leaves, "you cannot do it alone. You need the fire forgers. You need the 100-handed ones. And you need your siblings." Zeus listened. The playful boy of the caves was gone. In his place stood a young man with a beard of dark curls, shoulders broad enough to bear the weight of the heavens, and eyes that held the terrifying clarity of a storm front. The hidden years were ending. The shield clashing of the curetas was no longer needed to hide his cries, for he no longer cried. He was ready to roar. The time had come to leave the sanctuary of Crete. The time had come to introduce himself to his father. He did not march to Olympus with an army, for he had none. He went with a plan. He went with métis. He disguised his divinity, cloaking his blinding aura in the humble rags of a cupbearer. He left the caves of Ida, the scent of Amalthea's milk fading from his memory, replaced by the metallic scent of destiny. Zeus stepped off the island of Crete, and the first chapter of the Titanomachy began. The hidden god was hidden no more. The summit of Mount Olympus was not merely a mountain peak. It was the throne of the old world order. It pierced the cloud layer, a jagged obsidian needle where the air was too thin for mortals to breathe. Here, the Titans feasted in halls built of Cyclopean stone, their laughter sounding like rock slides, their goblets overflowing with dark, heady nectar. They were complacent. They were the masters of reality, and their king, Kronos, sat at the head of the table, his stomach distended with the weight of 5 gods and a stone. Into this den of giants walked a stranger. Zeus had left the wilds of Crete, shedding his identity as the hidden prince. He did not approach as a warrior clad in bronze, but as a servant. He had met with Metis, the Titaness of wisdom, a daughter of Oceanus, who had foreseen the shifting tides of power. Metis, with eyes like the deep sea and a mind sharper than any blade, had warned Zeus, "Force alone will not breach the king's gullet. You must use chemistry. You must use guile." She had brewed a mixture, a vile, potent concoction. It was not a poison meant to kill, for the Titans were immortal, but a purgative meant to violently reject. It was a slurry of mustard, salt, bitter herbs from the edges of the underworld, and poppy juice, masked by the sweetness of honeyed wine. Zeus, disguised by the glamour of Metis to appear as a young, non-threatening cupbearer, infiltrated the service of Kronos. The tension in the great hall was palpable. Zeus moved among the Titans, Oceanus, Hyperion, Iapetus, pouring wine, keeping his head low. He felt the immense, suffocating pressure of their auras. These were beings who embodied the pillars of the cosmos, the sun, the ocean, the mortality of life. He was an ant walking among lions. He reached the high table. Kronos slumped there, his eyes glazed with the boredom of eternity. The king looked at the new cupbearer. For a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. Did he recognize the eyes of his father, Uranos, in this boy? Did he smell the scent of Rhea? "Drink, my lord," Zeus said, his voice steady, betraying none of the thunder that roared in his veins. "A special vintage from the vineyards of the south." Kronos grunted, his suspicion dulled by eons of unchallenged rule. He snatched the goblet, his hand large enough to crush Zeus's skull like a grape. He drained it in one long, gluttonous gulp. The reaction was almost immediate. The emetic did not just upset the stomach, it assaulted the divine physiology. Kronos' face turned a sickly shade of green, then purple. He clutched his throat, gasping as the mixture boiled within him. The great hall fell silent. The other Titans stood confused, as their king doubled over, convulsing. The mountain shook. This was not an earthquake. It was the physical rejection of the unnatural order. With a roar of agony that shattered the crystal goblets on the tables, Kronos opened his maw. The first thing to emerge was the last thing he had swallowed, the stone, the omphalos. The decoy, wrapped in golden cloth, flew from his throat and crashed onto the marble floor, cracking the flagstones. It steamed with stomach acid and divine heat. Then came the living. Because they were gods, they had not been digested. Because they were immortal, they had grown within the timeless void of his stomach, fully formed, fully conscious, and seething with a lifetime of imprisonment. Poseidon came first, in the reverse order of birth. He erupted from the king's throat in a torrent of salt water, gasping for air, his eyes wild and tempestuous. He hit the floor, sliding in the bile, and immediately stood, shaking the slime from his hair. Next came Hades, silent and terrifying, a shadow pulled from the darkness into the light. He carried the chill of the grave, his expression unreadable, his pale skin steaming in the cool air of Othrys. Then Hera, glorious and terrible, her dignity unmarred even by this indignity. She rose with a scream of rage, wiping the filth from her face, her eyes locking onto the groaning form of her father with pure hatred. Demeter followed, bringing the scent of decay and earth, and finally, Hestia, the first swallowed and the last released, the keeper of the hearth, trembling but unbroken. The 5 siblings stood in a circle around the heaving king, slick with fluid, gasping, their divine auras flaring to life. Zeus stepped forward, shedding his disguise. He stood before them, crackling with ozone, the lightning beginning to arc across his skin. "Brothers," Zeus said, his voice booming, "sisters, I am Zeus, and the reign of the Eaters is over." Chaos erupted. The other Titans, realizing the treachery, drew their weapons, great blades of adamant and spears of jagged mountain rock. But the shock of the regurgitation had bought the siblings a moment of advantage. They did not fight then and there. They were unarmed and outnumbered. They fled. Guided by Zeus, the 6 Olympians, along with the stone which they took as a symbol, leaped from the parapets of Othrys. They transformed into birds, eagles, hawks, and falcons, diving into the cloud layer before the Titans could rally. They flew north, across the valleys of Thessaly, to the highest peak on the other side of the plain. They landed on Mount Olympus. Here, on the snow-capped heights, they established their fortress. It was a stark contrast to the dark masonry of Othrys. Olympus was open to the sky, a place of light and air. But there was no time to build palaces. They were refugees in a hostile cosmos. The reunion of the siblings was a scene of intense emotion. They looked upon Zeus, the youngest, the one who had lived free while they rotted in darkness. There was resentment, yes, but it was outweighed by gratitude and the recognition of his power. They saw the lightning dancing in his eyes. Without a vote, without a debate, they looked to him as their leader. He was the liberator, but looking across the Thessalian plain, they saw the fires of Othrys burning. The Titans were mobilizing. The sky turned black as Hyperion summoned the scorching heat of the sun. The oceans began to boil as Oceanus stirred the deeps. "We have no weapons," Hades noted, his voice like grinding gravel. "We have no army. We are 6 against a race of giants." Zeus looked at the Omphalos stone, now set upon the peak of Olympus. "We have something they do not," he replied, watching the storm clouds gather at his command. "We have the future, and we will find allies where they found only prisoners." Thus, the stage was set. The emetic had done its work. The family was whole. But the war of the Titans, the Titanomachy, had only just begun. The war did not begin with a decisive clash. It began with the breaking of the world. For 10 solar years, the cosmos was a battlefield where the laws of physics were treated as suggestions rather than rules. The Thessalian plain, the vast expanse of land separating Mount Olympus in the north from Mount Othrys in the south, became a wasteland of cratered earth and glassed sand. The Titans were beings of brute force and elemental magnitude. When they attacked, they did not march in formation. They tore up entire mountain peaks and hurled them like javelins. They altered the flow of rivers to drown the Olympian foothills. Atlas, the son of Iapetus, and the strongest of the Titan generals, led the assaults, his shoulders already bearing the metaphorical weight of his loyalty to Kronos. The Olympians, though fewer in number, fought with a desperate, agile ferocity. Zeus stood at the pinnacle of Olympus, calling down storms that blinded the enemy. Poseidon, having discovered his affinity for the earth-shaker powers, cracked the ground beneath the Titan's feet. Hades moved through the shadows, striking with the element of surprise. Hera, Demeter, and Hestia held the defensive lines, using their command over the natural world to create barriers of ice and vine. But it was a stalemate, a grinding, exhausting deadlock. The Titans were immortal. They could be broken, but they healed. They could be knocked down, but they stood up again. The Olympians possessed superior speed and strategy, but they lacked the raw firepower to deliver a killing blow. Every time Zeus threw a bolt of lightning, it scorched the skin of Kronos, but did not pierce his soul. The weapon was imperfect. It was merely concentrated weather, not yet a tool of divine judgment. 10 years. The earth groaned under the constant trauma. The sky was permanently choked with ash. Morale on Olympus was fracturing. They were tired. Gaia, the grandmother, spoke once more. She was the earth, and she was suffering more than any from this war. She appeared to Zeus not as a woman, but as a voice rising from a fissure in the rock. "You cannot win this war with the weapons you have, grandson," she rumbled. "You are fighting strength with strength. You need the artificers. You need the monsters." She spoke of the elder Cyclopes, Brontes, Steropes, and Arges, and the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones. These were the elder brothers of the Titans, tossed into the pit of Tartarus by Uranos, and kept there by Kronos. They were the shame of the Titan family, hideous, misshapen, but possessed of power that defied comprehension. "Free them," Gaia commanded, "and they will give you the means to end this." Zeus accepted the quest. He left the defense of Olympus to Poseidon and Hades, and descended. The journey to Tartarus was a descent into madness. He passed through the roots of the earth, past the sourceless rivers of Styx and Acheron. The pressure grew immense, enough to crush a lesser being. The darkness was absolute, a physical weight that pressed against the eyes. At the gates of the brazen prison of Tartarus stood the jailer, Campa. She was a nightmare made flesh, a dragon woman with the tail of a scorpion, snakes coiling around her ankles, and 50 heads of varying beasts growing from her waist. She was the watchdog of Kronos. The battle between Zeus and Campa was silent and brutal. In the deep dark there was no thunder, only the grappling of limbs and the tearing of scales. Zeus, tapping into a primal ferocity, managed to outmaneuver the beast, striking her down, not with lightning, but with a shard of jagged adamant he found on the floor of the abyss. He slew the jailer and took her keys. He unlocked the massive bronze doors. The smell that rolled out was the scent of stale eons, sweat, iron, and sorrow. Out stepped the Cyclopes. They were immense, with singular, expansive eyes in the center of their foreheads that blazed like searchlights. Brontes, thunder; Steropes, lightning; and Argus, brightness. They looked at Zeus, this small, glowing god, and they saw their liberator. They did not speak in words. They spoke in the language of the forge, grunts, sparks, and the clashing of hands. Behind them slithered the Hecatoncheires, Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges. They were terrifying to behold. Mountains of flesh with 50 heads and 100 arms each, flailing and twitching. They were pure kinetic energy, walking devastation. "I offer you freedom," Zeus told them, his voice echoing in the void. "And I offer you vengeance against the brother who kept you here. But first, I need arms." The Cyclopes were the master smiths of the cosmos. They did not need a forge. They used the heat of the Earth's core. They did not need hammers. They used their fists. In gratitude to Zeus, they set to work immediately within the pits of Tartarus. For Hades, they took the shadows of the underworld and hammered them into a helmet, the helm of darkness. Whoever wore it became truly invisible, not just unseen, but erased from the perception of others, a void in reality. For Poseidon, they took the bedrock of the earth and the pressure of the deep sea. They forged a 3-pronged spear, the trident. It could shatter rock, summon horses from the foam, and shake the foundations of the world. And for Zeus, for the liberator, they reached into the concept of the storm itself. They took the sound of the boom, the heat of the flash, and the speed of the strike. They hammered pure energy into a solid form. They forged the master bolt. This was not the flickering lightning Zeus had summoned on Crete. This was a weapon of mass destruction. It was a javelin of condensed plasma, unstable, humming with a sound that made teeth ache. It radiated a light so intense it cast shadows in the pitch black of Tartarus. Zeus took the bolt in his hand. It felt heavy, not with mass, but with authority. When he gripped it, the current surged up his arm, turning his veins into rivers of white fire. He felt his power amplify 1,000-fold. He was no longer just the god of the sky. He was the Lord of Justice. "Now," Zeus said, his eyes glowing with a terrifying electric blue light that illuminated the hideous faces of his new army. "Now, we finish it." The ascent from Tartarus was swift. Zeus led his monstrous uncles up the secret passages of the earth. They emerged back into the light of the upper world, squinting against the sun. They returned to Olympus just as the Titans were launching a massive offensive. Atlas was scaling the slopes, smashing the defensive walls. The Olympians were retreating to the highest peak. Hope was fading. Then, the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. The air pressure dropped so rapidly that the ears of every living thing popped. A sound began, a low hum that rose to a deafening shriek. Zeus stood on the summit, the Hecatoncheires flanking him like living mountains of limbs, the Cyclopes standing behind him like towers of bronze. He raised the master bolt. For the first time in history, true thunder spoke. Krakoum! He hurled the bolt. It crossed the distance to the advancing Titan army in a fraction of a second. It struck the ground at the feet of Atlas. The explosion was nuclear. White light swallowed the battlefield. The shockwave knocked Titans off their feet and shattered the eardrums of the world. The stalemate was broken. The war of attrition was over. The war of annihilation had begun. The silence that followed the first strike of the master bolt was not a peace. It was a vacuum, the indrawn breath of a universe bracing for impact. The scorch mark on the Thessalian plain where the bolt had landed was a crater of fused glass, smoking and glowing with a radioactive blue hue. The Titans, those towering pillars of the old world, stood momentarily frozen. For 10 years, they had known only the blunt trauma of rocks and the stinging of minor storms. They had never seen the sky turn into a weapon. Kronos stood on the ramparts of Othrys, his knuckles white, as he gripped the black stone. He felt a sensation he had not experienced since the prophecy was first whispered to him eons ago: mortality. The scent of ozone drifting from the Olympian lines was the scent of his own doom. But he was the king. He roared, a sound that cracked the glaciers on the surrounding peaks and signaled the charge. "Destroy them," he bellowed. "Rip the mountain from its roots." But the Olympians were no longer fighting a defensive war. They had unleashed the nightmares of the earth. Zeus gave the signal. It was not a shout, but a gesture, a downward sweep of his hand. From the flanks of Mount Olympus, the Hecatoncheires advanced. To describe the assault of the 100-handed ones is to describe a geological catastrophe in motion. Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges did not move like men. They moved like rolling avalanches of flesh and muscle. As they stepped onto the battlefield, their 300 hands reached down simultaneously. They did not grasp weapons. They grasped the landscape. Each hand ripped a boulder from the earth, massive, jagged rocks the size of houses. In a single heartbeat, 300 projectiles were airborne. The sky turned black. It was not night. It was a ceiling of stone. The barrage whistled through the air, a chaotic shrieking of displaced atmosphere, before slamming into the Titan ranks. Thud, 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 crash. The impact was ceaseless. It was a machine gun fire of geology. The Titans, strong as they were battered backward. Shields of adamant were dented and crushed. Armor was sheared away. They could not advance because the very air was filled with flying mountains. And behind this curtain of stone, the Olympians struck. Poseidon, wielding his new trident, struck the earth. He did not just shake the ground. He liquefied it. Fissures opened beneath the feet of the Titan vanguard. Great warriors who had stood since the dawn of time stumbled as the ground swallowed them to their waists, trapping them in crushing vices of bedrock. The sea, summoned by his will, surged inland, a wall of gray foaming water that crashed into the Titan lines, extinguishing their torches and filling their lungs with brine. Hades, wearing the helm of darkness, was the phantom of the battlefield. He moved unseen, a silent void in the chaos. He did not fight for glory. He fought for terror. A Titan would raise his sword to block a blow, only to feel a cold blade slide between his ribs from behind. Weapons vanished from hands. Vital supplies disappeared. The Titans began to fight shadows, swinging wildly at empty air, their paranoia growing with every silent takedown. But the center of the storm was Zeus. He did not walk. He floated upon a cushion of updrafts, his eyes burning with white fire. He held the master bolt, and he did not spare it. He threw bolt after bolt, a relentless bombardment of electrical judgment. The bolts did not just burn, they disintegrated. They struck the black towers of Othrys, melting the stone into lava that cascaded down the fortress walls. The heat was absolute. The theogony tells us that the earth melted like tin in a crucible. The forests caught fire, not from sparks, but from the sheer ambient temperature of the lightning. The oceans hissed and steamed, the water evaporating into thick, scalding fogs that rolled over the combatants. The boundary between earth and sky dissolved into a chaotic swirling of fire, steam, and electricity. Kronos saw his army crumbling. He saw Atlas struggling under the weight of the stone bombardment. He saw Menoetius blasted by a lightning bolt that left him a smoking husk. The king of Titans realized that the prophecy was not just a threat. It was a fixed point in time. He was arriving at his end. In a final, desperate act, Kronos engaged Zeus directly. The two kings met in the center of the ruined plain. Kronos wielded his sickle, the jagged flint blade that had castrated the sky. It dripped with the dark energy of the void. Zeus wielded the bolt. The duel was fought on a plane of existence that mortals could not perceive. It was a clash of concepts, time against destiny, stagnation against progress. Kronos tried to slow the air around Zeus, to freeze him in a moment of vulnerability. But Zeus was too fast, too bright. The lightning shattered the time dilation. Zeus struck, not with the bolt, but with the hilt, smashing the sickle from his father's hand. Then he raised the master bolt for the final strike. The air screamed. Zeus drove the bolt into the chest of Kronos, not to kill, for a god cannot die, but to shatter his spirit. The blast blew Kronos backward, skipping him across the molten earth like a stone on water. He slammed into the base of Mount Olympus, the impact collapsing the main gate of his own fortress on top of him. Silence returned to the battlefield, but it was the silence of total devastation. The Titans were broken. They lay scattered, burned, battered by rocks, and tangled in seaweed. But the war was not over until the prisoners were secured. Zeus knew that if left free, they would heal. They would rise again. "Grandmother," Zeus whispered to the earth, "open the way." Gaia, though pained by the war, conceded to the new order. The ground in the center of the plain split open. It was not a fissure, it was a maw. The chasm went down, down, past the roots of the mountains, past the caves of the Drow, all the way to the misty, gloomy Tartarus. Zeus ordered the Hecatoncheires to gather the fallen Titans. It was a grim harvest. The 100-handed ones picked up the defeated gods, Kronos, Iapetus, Coeus, Creus, binding them in chains forged by the Cyclopes. They dragged them to the edge of the pit. One by one, the former masters of the universe were cast down. They fell for 9 days and 9 nights. That is the depth of the abyss. An anvil dropped from heaven would fall 9 days to earth, and 9 days more to reach Tartarus. The sound of their impact was a dull thud felt in the soles of the Olympians' feet. Only Atlas was spared the pit, for his strength was too great, and his punishment needed to be functional. Zeus condemned him to the western edge of the world. There, he was forced to take the weight of the sky, the celestial sphere that his father Iapetus had once held unstable, upon his shoulders. He became the living pillar, separating the heavens from the earth, ensuring they would never again embrace to birth such monsters. Zeus stood over the chasm of Tartarus. He signaled the Cyclopes to seal it. Great bronze doors were fitted over the hole, and a wall was built around it. The Hecatoncheires, the former prisoners, volunteered to become the jailers. They took up their posts at the gates. 300 hands ready to shove back any titan who dared to climb the walls of the abyss. The Titanomachy was over. The smoke began to clear. The sun, hidden for 10 years behind ash and storm clouds, broke through the gloom. It shone on a world that was scarred, reshaped, and empty. Zeus looked at his siblings. They were covered in ash and ichor, breathing hard, their eyes wide with the realization of what they had done. They had killed the past. Now they had to invent the future. With the doors of Tartarus sealed and the echoes of war fading into the new silence, the universe held a breath of anticipation. The violence was finished, but the architecture of power remained unbuilt. The cosmos was a raw, unclaimed estate. There was no king, only a victor. The three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, gathered on the highest peak of the newly liberated Olympus. The air was crisp and cold. Below them, the world was healing. The rivers were finding their beds again. The forests were beginning to push green shoots through the ash. It was time to divide the spoils. By right of power and leadership, Zeus could have claimed it all. He possessed the master bolt. He had led the charge. He had freed the siblings. But Zeus possessed Metis, wisdom. He knew that a tyranny like his father's would only breed another rebellion. To rule the cosmos, he needed buy-in. He needed his brothers to feel like kings in their own right, not merely vassals. So, they agreed to the drawing of lots. It was the most significant gamble in the history of existence. They took a helmet. Some say it was the helm of darkness itself. Others say a simple soldier's helm of bronze. Into it, they placed 3 shards of pottery, ostraka. One was marked for the sky, one for the sea, one for the underworld. The earth, Gaia, and the high Olympus would remain common ground, neutral territory where all could walk. Hades, the eldest male by birth, though the last regurgitated, reached in first. His pale hand disappeared into the helm. He did not hesitate. He pulled out a shard and turned it over. The underworld. A shadow passed over his face, fleeting but dark. The realm of the dead. The unseen lands. The place furthest from the light of the sun and the laughter of the gods. It was a kingdom of immense wealth. All the gold and gems in the earth belonged to it, but it was a lonely, silent dominion. Hades did not complain. He was a god of duty. He nodded, his face setting into the stony mask that would define him forever. He accepted the role of the invisible king. Poseidon reached in next. He swirled his hand, his eyes reflecting the turbulence of his nature. He drew his shard. The sea. A grin split his bearded face. The ocean was vast, moody, violent, and deep. It suited him. It was a place of storms and monsters, of calm depths and crashing waves. He gripped his trident, feeling the call of the tides pulling at his blood. He would be the earth shaker, the lord of the deep. That left the final shard for Zeus. He did not need to look at it, but he drew it out and held it up to the light. The sky, the ether, the clouds, the thunder, and with it the implicit title of King of Gods. For the sky covers all, the sky sees all. He who holds the high ground holds the throne. The division was complete. The cosmos had its managers. The next age was one of construction. The Cyclopes, now the honored architects of the gods, set to work on Mount Olympus. They did not build with mortal brick and mortar. They built with light, marble, and gold. They constructed the 12 thrones. They built the bronze pavement where the gods would feast. They built the automotones, tripods that moved of their own accord to serve ambrosia. Zeus sat on the highest throne, polished black marble inlaid with gold stars. But he was not alone. The issue of succession, the curse of the bloodline, still hung over him. Uranos had fallen. Kronos had fallen. Would Zeus fall too? He took a wife. Not Hera, not yet. He married Metis, the Titaness of wisdom, the one who had given him the emetic, the one who had guided him through the war. She was his equal in mind, perhaps his superior in cunning. It was a union of power and thought. But Gaia, the ever-watchful grandmother, whispered a new prophecy to Zeus. "Be warned, king of the sky. Metis will bear you 2 children. The first will be a daughter, equal to you in strength and wisdom. But the second will be a son, a king of gods and men, who will wield a weapon stronger than the Thunderbolt and overthrow you." The paranoia that had driven Kronos mad flickered in Zeus's mind. But Zeus was not Kronos. Kronos was a blunt instrument. He tried to stop the prophecy by suppressing the result, swallowing the children. Zeus decided to stop the prophecy by assimilating the cause. He began a game of shape-shifting with Meti. They changed forms, playfully at first, becoming lions, eagles, serpents. But Meti, for all her wisdom, trusted him. In a moment of vulnerability, when she had shifted into a drop of water, or perhaps a fly, Zeus did not swallow her womb. He swallowed her. He swallowed wisdom whole. It was not a frantic gulp like Kronos. It was a deliberate integration. Metis did not die. She dissolved into his being. She took up residence in his mind, becoming his internal counselor. From that day on, Zeus was never alone in his thoughts. He had the voice of wisdom, whispering strategies, calming his rages, and sharpening his plans. He had ended the cycle of succession by becoming the synthesis of male and female, force and guile. But the child Meti was carrying could not be so easily absorbed. Months later, a pain began in Zeus's head. It was not a headache. It was a cranial splitting. It felt as if a spear was being driven through his temples from the inside out. The pain was so intense that his screams echoed across the earth, causing mortals to cover their ears. He thrashed on his throne, the lightning flashing uncontrollably around him. He called for help. Prometheus, the Titan who had sided with him, or, as some accounts say, the newly formed Hephaestus, arrived with a double-headed axe, Labris. "Strike me," Zeus commanded, pointing to the center of his forehead. "Split it open." It was a command of madness, but no one disobeyed the king. The axe descended. It cleaved the skull of Zeus, a wound that would have been fatal to any other being. But no blood flowed. Instead, a cry of war rang out, clear and piercing. From the cleft in Zeus's head leaped a figure. She was fully grown. She was dressed in full battle armor, gleaming gold. She held a sharp spear in one hand and a shield in the other. She landed on the floor of Olympus with a clang that shook the mountain. She looked at Zeus, her gray eyes flashing with intelligence. The eyes of Metis, but with the fire of the Sky Father. This was Athena. She was the daughter the prophecy had spoken of. equal to her father in strength and wisdom. But because she was born of him alone, or so it seemed, because she had no mother to turn her against him, and because she was a daughter, not the prophesied son, she was not a threat. She was his greatest ally. She was the manifestation of his strategic mind. Zeus looked at her, the headache gone, replaced by a surge of paternal pride. He had cheated fate. He had produced the powerful child, but kept his throne. With the cosmos divided, the threats imprisoned, and his wisdom internalized, the reign of the Olympians truly began. But the world below, the world of men, was still a place of darkness and confusion, and there were other threats, older threats, stirring in the deep earth. Gaia was not finished with her grandson yet. The Earthborn were coming. The victory over the Titans was absolute, but it was not without consequence. The cosmos is a system of balances, and the imprisonment of the Titans in the pit of Tartarus had tipped the scales violently. Gaia, the Earth Mother, was grieving. She had seen her first children, the Titans, cast into the darkness by her grandson Zeus. Her sorrow hardened into a bedrock of rage. She did not raise an army this time. She decided to birth a calamity. She lay with Tartarus, the spirit of the great pit itself. From this union of earth and abyss, the ultimate monster was born. His name was Typhon, or Typhoeus. The poets struggle to describe him, for he defied the geometry of living things. Hesiod tells us he was a horror whose strength was in his hands and whose feet were tireless. From his shoulders grew 100 heads of a snake, a terrible dragon, each one flickering with dark tongues. Fire flashed from his eyes. Voices of every kind echoed from his throats, sometimes the speech of gods, sometimes the bellowing of bulls, the roaring of lions, or the yelp of puppies. He was a cacophony of nature's most violent aspects, compressed into a single form. Typhon did not just walk. He rose. His head brushed the stars. His arms, when spread, touched the east and the west. He was a storm made flesh, a hurricane with a heartbeat. He marched on Olympus. The reaction of the Olympians, freshly victorious from the Titanomachy, was not one of courage. It was one of primal panic. As Typhon approached, he hurled mountains and spewed rivers of fire. The sight of him was so terrifying that the gods, save for Zeus, fled. Later traditions, such as those recorded by Ovid and Antoninus Liberalis, recount a moment of divine humiliation. The gods ran to Egypt to hide from the monster. To conceal themselves, they shed their divine forms and took the shapes of animals. Apollo became a hawk, Hermes an ibis, Ares a fish, Dionysus a goat. Even Hera, the queen, transformed into a white cow. Only Zeus stood his ground. He stood alone on the peak of Olympus, the last line of defense against the return of chaos. He was not just a king defending a throne. He was the concept of order defending against entropy. He held the Thunderbolt in his hand, and he wielded an adamantine sickle, the very blade he had taken from Kronos. "You are a mistake," Zeus roared at the approaching storm, his voice amplified by the thunder. "And I will correct you." The battle that ensued was not a war. It was a duel of catastrophes. Typhon threw mountains. Zeus shattered them in midair with lightning. Typhon spewed streams of poison, Zeus vaporized them with heat. The impact of their collision shook the roots of the earth. The sea boiled, and the sky turned the color of bruised flesh. But Typhon was not like the Titans. He was faster, more fluid. He closed the distance. He grappled with Zeus. The monster's strength was overwhelming. He wrapped his serpentine coils around the king of gods, crushing the breath from his divine lungs. He wrenched the sickle from Zeus's grip. Then Typhon did the unthinkable. He used the sickle to slice the sinews from Zeus's hands and feet. The king of Olympus fell, crippled. He was no longer a warrior. He was a heap of immortal flesh, unable to move, unable to summon the lightning. Typhon laughed, a sound of 100 hissing snakes. He picked up the helpless Zeus and carried him across the sea to the Dictaean Cave in Cilicia. He tossed the god into the dark, and he hid the severed sinews in a bearskin rug, setting the dragon woman Delphine to guard them. For a moment, it seemed the reign of Olympus was over before it had truly begun. The cosmos held its breath. The king was broken. But Metisses, the wisdom Zeus had swallowed, was not dead. And Zeus had allies who operated in the shadows. Hermes, the trickster son of Zeus, born of Maia, and Aegipan, Pan, crept into the cave. They did not come with force. They came with guile. Hermes played a song on his lyre, or reed pipes, a melody so sweet, so hypnotic, that it lulled the dragon Delphine to sleep. With the precision of a surgeon, Hermes stole the bearskin. He found the sinews, glowing strands of divine fiber. He crept to the broken form of his father. With divine skill, Hermes refitted the sinews to Zeus's hands and feet. He knit the god back together. Zeus gasped. The power rushed back into his limbs. The pain was replaced by a cold, crystallized fury. He did not thank Hermes. There was no time. He rose. He summoned a chariot drawn by winged horses. He flew back to Olympus, reclaimed his Thunderbolt, and returned to the fight. Typhon was stunned. He saw the god he had crippled descending from the heavens like a falling star. Zeus did not hold back. He unleashed the full stockpile of his arsenal. He threw 100 bolts in a single heartbeat. He burned the 100 heads of the monster. Typhon, scorched and battered, fled. He ran to Mount Nisa, where the Moirai, fates, tricked him into eating ephemeral fruits, promising strength but delivering weakness. He fled across the sea to Thrace, throwing whole mountain ranges at Zeus. Zeus deflected them. The mountains fell back, creating the Hemus Range, the Bloody Mountains. Finally, Typhon fled to the west, to the island of Sicily. He tried to lift the entirety of Mount Etna to throw at the pursuer. Zeus saw his opening. He flew above the mountain. With a shout that shattered the windows of the sky, he struck the peak of Etna with a bolt of infinite mass. The mountain collapsed. It crushed Typhon beneath millions of tons of rock. The monster was trapped. But Typhon was immortal. He could not die. He remains there to this day, buried beneath Etna. When the mountain smokes, it is his breath. When the earth shakes, it is his struggle against the weight of the island. Zeus hovered over the volcano, his chest heaving, his body scarred but whole. He had faced the ultimate enemy alone. He had known fear He had known defeat, and he had risen. He was no longer just the inheritor of the throne. He had earned it. The gods returned from Egypt, resuming their forms, their heads bowed in shame and awe. They looked at their king, who had bled for them. The hierarchy of Olympus was solidified not by decree, but by the undeniable proof of power. But Gaia was not done. The earth had one final card to play. If a single monster could not break the sky, perhaps an army could. The defeat of Typhon brought a temporary quiet to the cosmos, but the grudge of Gaia was eternal. She had seen her titans imprisoned, and her greatest son, Typhon, buried under a volcano. Her anger fermented in the deep soil. From the drops of blood that had fallen from the severed genitals of Uranos ages ago, she had incubated a new race. These were the Gigantes, the giants. They were not merely tall men. They were forces of terrestrial violence. Apollodorus describes them with legs of serpents, hair of tangled snakes, and eyes that burned with madness. They were born for one purpose: to storm heaven. They were the Earthborn, and because they were born of the earth, they possessed a specific, terrifying immunity. They could not be killed by any god. A prophecy hung over this war, older than the giants themselves. It stated that the giants could only be defeated if the gods allied with a mortal. A god could strike them down, but the giant would simply heal, drawing strength from their mother, the earth. Only a mortal hand could deal the finishing blow. Zeus knew this prophecy. He knew he needed a champion. He looked to the mortal world, to the woman Alcmene, and he fathered a son. This was Heracles, Hercules. The hero was raised not just for labors, but for war. The invasion began at Phlegra, the burning fields. The giants did not use strategy. They used elevation. They began to pile mountain upon mountain, Ossa upon Pelion, attempting to build a staircase to Olympus. They hurled burning oaks and massive boulders at the sky. The king of the giants was Porphyrion. The greatest warrior was Alcyoneus. Zeus rallied the Olympians. This time, there was no flight to Egypt. The gods stood their ground, armed and ready. But Zeus also sent Athena to fetch the mortal. Heracles arrived, clad in his lion skin, holding a bow strung with sinew and arrows dipped in the venom of the Hydra. The battle was a chaotic melee of magic and muscle. Heracles targeted Alcyoneus first. The giant was invincible as long as he stood on the soil of his birth, Phlegra. Heracles shot him with an arrow, and the giant fell, but the earth immediately began to knit his flesh back together. "He heals!" Heracles shouted over the din of battle. Athena, the voice of wisdom, appeared at his shoulder. "Drag him away," she commanded. "Remove him from his source." Heracles, displaying the strength that had strangled the Nemean lion, grappled the massive giant. He dragged Alcyoneus across the border, out of Phlegra. The moment the giant's serpent legs left his native soil, his immortality vanished. Heracles smashed his skull with his olive wood club. The first giant fell. Meanwhile, Porphyrion, the king of giants, sought to destroy Hera. He rushed the Queen of Heaven, tearing her robes. Hera cried out. Zeus, watching from the high ether, saw his wife in peril. A surge of protective rage filled him. He hurled a thunderbolt that struck Porphyrion in the chest, stunning him, but the bolt did not kill him. It only knocked him down. "Now, son," Zeus roared. Heracles stepped forward and loosed an arrow. It pierced the giant's heart. Porphyrion died, slain by the combination of the Sky Father and the mortal sun. The battle raged across the world. Athena faced Enceladus. The giant fled across the sea, but the gray-eyed goddess gave chase. She did not use a weapon. She used the landscape. She lifted the island of Sicily, or a massive chunk of land that became the island, and dropped it on top of him. Like Typhon, he was buried, but dead. Poseidon faced Polybotes. The giant fled to the island of Kos. Poseidon used his trident to shear off a piece of the island, Nisseros, and slammed it down upon the giant, crushing him. Hermes, wearing the helmet of Hades to become invisible, slew Hippolytus. Artemis shot Gratian. The Fates, Moirai, themselves joined the fray, beating the giants Agrius and Thun to death with clubs made of bronze, proving that even destiny has fists. Through it all, Zeus coordinated the slaughter. He was the conductor of a symphony of violence. He used the Thunderbolt to stun, to burn, to knock the giants prone, setting them up for Heracles. It was a perfect partnership. The divine provided the shock. The mortal provided the finality. The field of Phlegra was littered with the bodies of the earthborn. The pile of mountains they had built was toppled. This victory was different from the Titanomachy. The Titan War was a civil war, family against family. The Gigantomachy was a war of supremacy, order asserting its right to rule over the chaotic forces of nature. By using a mortal to win, Zeus had validated the existence of humanity. He showed that mortals were not just pets or victims, but essential instruments in the cosmic order. Zeus stood over the carnage, his chest heaving. Heracles stood beside him, a man among gods, wiping black blood from his club. Father and son. Gaia retreated into the depths, her rage finally exhausted. She accepted, at last, that the sky could not be pulled down. The external threats were vanquished. There were no more titans to fight, no more monsters to slay. The universe was secure. But peace brings its own problems. A king in wartime is a general. A king in peacetime is a politician. Zeus now had to govern. He had to manage the complex, petty, and powerful court he had created, and he had to manage his own heart. The era of wars was over. The era of the divine court and the divine affairs had begun. With the Titanomachy won and the Gigantomachy quelled, Zeus sat upon the throne of Olympus not merely as a warlord, but as the architect of reality. The universe was safe, but it was raw. It lacked the nuanced structures of civilization, law, art, seasons, and grace. To build these pillars, Zeus did not use stone. He used his own bloodline. The Theogony of Hesiod recounts the canonical 7 wives of Zeus before his final marriage to Hera. These unions were not born of mere lust, but of political and cosmic necessity. He was breeding the concepts that would govern the world. We have already spoken of Metis, wisdom, the first wife whom he absorbed to secure his rule. She remained within him, the internal voice of strategy. His second consort was Themis, the titaness of divine law and custom. She represented the unshakable rules of the universe, gravity, moral obligation, and truth. From this union of power, Zeus and law, Themis, the Horae, the seasons, were born. Eunomia, order, Dike, justice, and Irene, peace. These three daughters regulated the passage of time and the conduct of men. They ensured that summer followed spring, and that consequences followed actions. But Themis bore him a darker, more potent triad as well, the Moirai, the Fates, Clotho, the Spinner, Lachesis, the Allotter, and Atropos, the Unturnable. These three ancient women sat in the white halls of Olympus, spinning the thread of every life, mortal and divine. Even Zeus, it is whispered, was bound to respect the length of the thread they measured. By fathering the Fates, Zeus aligned his will with destiny itself. He made fate a member of his household. Next, Zeus turned to Eurynome, a daughter of the ocean. She was the embodiment of water's fluidity and charm. She bore him the Charitas, the Graces, Aglaia, Splendor, Euphrosyne, Mirth, and Thalia, good cheer. These goddesses brought joy to the world. They were the patrons of festivities, dance, and the social graces that separate men from beasts. Without them, life would be survival. With them, life became culture. Then came Demeter, his sister, the bountiful earth. This union was one of elemental resonance. It produced Persephone, Kore, the maiden of spring. In her, the vitality of the earth was distilled. Her later abduction by Hades would create the cycle of winter and summer, a grief that Zeus would have to arbitrate, balancing the needs of the underworld with the hunger of the living. But perhaps the most significant cultural union was with Yamna, the Titaness of memory. Zeus sought her out in the foothills of Pieria. For 9 consecutive nights, the king of gods lay with memory, away from the eyes of Olympus. It was a ritual of transmission. From these 9 nights, Mnemosyne bore 9 daughters, the Muses: Calliope, epic poetry; Clio, history; Euterpe, music; Erato, lyric poetry; Melpomene, tragedy; Polyhymnia, sacred song; Terpsichore, dance; Thalia, comedy; and Urania, astronomy. Through this union, Zeus created the archive of the universe. The Muses were the voices that would sing the deeds of the gods to mortals. They were the bridge between the divine act and the human understanding of it. Without the Muses, the glory of Zeus would be forgotten. With them, it became eternal song. 6th was Leto, a titaness of gentle heart. But this union brought the first shadows of the domestic war that would plague Zeus's reign. Hera, not yet his wife but already jealous of his station, or perhaps foreseeing her own role, persecuted Leto. She forbade any land under the sun to offer Leto a place to birth her children. Zeus had to intervene subtly. He guided Leto to the floating island of Delos, a land that was technically not land because it drifted. There, clutching a palm tree, Leto birthed the twin archers, Apollo and Artemis. Apollo, the god of light, prophecy, and music, became the right hand of Zeus, the interpreter of his will. Artemis, the mistress of the hunt, governed the wild places. They were the radiant enforcers of the Olympian order. Finally, the era of the consorts ended, and the era of the queen began. Zeus turned his eyes to his sister Hera. She was his equal in majesty. While Zeus ruled the ether, Hera ruled the air itself. She was dignified, proud, and fiercely protective of the structure of marriage. She did not yield to him easily. The courtship was a battle of wills. The myth tells us that Zeus resorted to a ruse. Knowing Hera's compassion for small, helpless creatures, he transformed himself into a cuckoo bird. He summoned a torrential rainstorm and flew, shivering and soaked, to Hera's window. Seeing the poor creature, Hera opened her window and tucked the bird into the folds of her dress to warm it at her breast. At that moment, Zeus shed the disguise and resumed his true form. Their wedding, the hierosgamos, sacred marriage, was the greatest spectacle the cosmos had ever seen. The Earth Mother, Gaia, gave them a garden of golden apples, the Hesperides, as a wedding gift. All the gods attended. The Fates sang the wedding hymn. It was the union that stabilized the hierarchy of Olympus. Hera bore him children who embodied the nature of their union. Ares, war, the manifestation of their conflict. Hebe, youth, the cupbearer, and Eileithyia, childbirth. Some traditions say Hephaestus was born of Hera alone in retaliation for Athena, while others say he was their son. But the marriage was not peaceful. It was a reflection of the stormy sky. Zeus and Hera argued with the ferocity of typhoons. Hera was the jealous guardian of monogamy in a polygamous world. She persecuted Zeus's lovers and his illegitimate children with a vindictive creativity that terrified the cosmos. Zeus, for his part, respected her above all others, yet he could not be contained by her. He was the sky. He covered everything. He was the generator of life. He punished her when she went too far, once hanging her from the sky with anvils tied to her ankles, as recounted in the Iliad, but he always restored her to the golden throne. The court of Zeus was now fully staffed. The 12 Olympians took their seats. Zeus sat at the center, the pater familias. He was no longer the rebel prince of the cave. He was the bearded king, the brow that shook the universe when he frowned. He held the scales of fate. He settled disputes between Apollo and Hermes, between Ares and Athena. He had built a family. He had built a government. Now, he turned his gaze downward to the creatures of clay that Prometheus had shaped. The age of heroes was approaching, and Zeus intended to be the father of them all. The great seductions of Zeus are often misunderstood by the modern mind as mere acts of libido. In the ancient worldview, however, they were acts of divine transmission. The distance between gods and men was vast. Mortals were weak, short-lived, and prone to misery. To bridge this gap, to create a race of men capable of defending the earth and upholding justice, Zeus had to inject divine ichor into the human bloodline. He had to father the heroes. These interventions were characterized by metamorphosis. Zeus rarely appeared to mortals in his true form, for his true form, the raw glory of the lightning, would incinerate them. He came as they needed to see him, or as the situation demanded. King Acrisius of Argos had locked his daughter, Danae, in a tower of bronze, or a subterranean chamber, fearful of a prophecy that her son would kill him. The tower was hermetically sealed. No man could enter. But Acrisius forgot that the sky cannot be locked out. Zeus looked down and saw the princess in her solitude. He did not break the roof. He dissolved. He transformed his divine body into a shower of golden rain. He poured through the roof tiles a shimmering liquid light that pooled on her lap. It was a silent, ethereal conception. There was no violence, only the warm weight of the gold. From this alchemical union, Perseus was born, the hero who would slay the Gorgon. He was the result of the divine penetrating the impenetrable. To the Phoenician coast, Zeus traveled to find Europa, a princess of high lineage. She was playing in a meadow by the sea. Zeus did not descend as a king. He emerged from the sea foam as a bull, but he was no ordinary beast. His hide was as white as fresh snow, his horns curved like the crescent moon. He was gentle, breathing the scent of saffron, crocus, from his mouth. Charmed by the creature's supernatural calm, Europa placed flowers on his horns. She climbed onto his broad back. The moment she was seated, the bull plunged into the sea. He did not swim. He ran across the waves, his hooves staying dry. The Nereids rose from the deep to escort them. Poseidon calmed the waters. They crossed the Mediterranean all the way to Crete, the very island of Zeus's birth. There, beneath an evergreen plane tree, or in the Dictaean Cave, he revealed his true self. From this union came Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Sarpedon, kings who would become the judges of the underworld. Europa gave her name to a continent, and her sons built the first great civilization of the Greeks, the Minoan. Leda, the wife of King Tyndareus of Sparta, walked by the banks of the river Eurotas. She saw a swan, white and majestic, fleeing from an eagle. It was Zeus, playing the role of the refugee to garner sympathy. The swan took shelter in her arms. The union was avian and strange. That night, Leda lay with both the swan and her husband. The result was a double conception, birthed in eggs. From one egg hatched Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, and Polydeuces, the divine twin. From the other came Clytemnestra and Castor, the mortal twin. This intervention sowed the seeds of the Trojan War. Zeus was not just fathering children. He was planting the characters for the greatest drama in human history. Of all the mortal loves, the story of Semele is the most tragic, for it reveals the danger of the divine. Semele was a princess of Thebes. Zeus loved her deeply, visiting her in the dark of night, cloaked in shadows. But Hera, ever the saboteur, appeared to Semele disguised as her old nurse. She planted a seed of doubt. How do you know he is truly the king of gods? Perhaps he is a monster. Make him prove it. Make him swear to show you his true face. Semele, young and foolish, extracted a promise from Zeus. She made him swear on the river Styx, the unbreakable oath, that he would grant her one wish. Zeus swore. "Come to me as you come to Hera," she demanded, "in all your glory." Zeus groaned. He tried to dissuade her, but the oath was binding. He ascended to Olympus and donned his armaments, not the bolts he used to shatter mountains, but the smallest, lightest bolts he could find. He entered her chamber. But even the smallest fraction of his true nature was too much for mortal flesh. The room filled with the heat of a star. Semele caught fire. She was consumed by the glory of her lover. But the child within her was divine. As Semele died, Zeus reached into the flames. He snatched the unborn infant, Dionysus, from her womb. To save the child, Zeus cut open his own thigh and sewed the fetus inside. Months later, Dionysus was born from the thigh of Zeus. He was the twice-born, the god of wine, madness, and ecstasy. He was the only Olympian with a mortal mother, a bridge between the earth and the sky. Not all of Zeus's affections were for women. He looked upon the Trojan plains and saw Ganymede, a young prince of such astounding beauty that he rivaled the immortals. Zeus transformed into a giant eagle, or sent his royal eagle. He swooped down, snatching the boy from among his sheep. He carried him up to Olympus. There was no tragedy here, only elevation. Ganymede was made immortal. He was given the honor of being the cupbearer to the gods, pouring the red nectar into their gold cups. It was a testament to Zeus's appreciation of beauty in all forms. He placed Ganymede's image in the stars as Aquarius, the water-bearer, or associated with the eagle, Aquila. Through these interventions, Zeus populated the earth with demigods: Heracles, Perseus, Minos, Helen. These were not random accidents. As the Cypria, a lost epic of the Trojan cycle, suggests, Zeus was planning a great culling. The earth was heavy with people. The tribes of men were numerous and noisy. He was breeding the heroes who would fight the great wars. He was setting the stage for the end of the age of heroes. He was the director, casting the roles for the Iliad. The mortal world was now full of his blood. The stage was set for the final judgment. But before the end, there was one more conflict. A conflict not of arms, but of wits. The conflict with the one Titan who had sided with him, only to betray him for the love of man. Prometheus. The relationship between Zeus and the race of men was never one of simple benevolence. It was a relationship defined by negotiation, suspicion, and punishment. While Zeus was the father of gods, his role as the father of men was complicated by the interference of one figure, Prometheus. Prometheus was a Titan, the son of Iapetus. He had sided with Zeus during the Titanomachy, seeing that the brute force of Othrys would lose to the cunning of Olympus. But Prometheus loved the creatures of clay, the mortals, more than he respected the king of heaven. The conflict began at Mycone. Gods and men had gathered to settle a dispute regarding sacrifices. How much of the animal should be given to the gods, and how much kept for the hunger of men? Prometheus, the trickster, sought to deceive Zeus. He slaughtered a great ox and divided it into 2 piles. In one pile, he placed the rich, fatty meat, but he covered it with the unappetizing stomach lining. In the other pile, he placed the bare white bones, but he covered them with glistening, delicious fat. He asked Zeus to choose. Hesiod tells us that Zeus, whose wisdom is everlasting, saw through the trick immediately. But he played along to justify the punishment he was already planning. He chose the pile of white bones covered in fat. When he lifted the fat and revealed the bare bones underneath, he feigned a terrible rage. From that day forth, men would burn the white bones on the altars to the gods, keeping the meat for themselves. The separation was made. Men eat to survive. Gods subsist on the smoke and the honor. In retaliation for this trick, and perhaps for the benefits men gained, Zeus withheld the greatest tool of civilization, fire. He hid it from the mortal world. He wanted men to remain shivering in the dark, dependent and weak, but Prometheus would not allow it. The Titan climbed Mount Olympus in secret. He took a hollow stalk of giant fennel, narthex. He approached the chariot of the sun, or, in some versions, the forge of Hephaestus, and stole a single ember. He hid the spark inside the fennel stalk and carried it down to the earth. Suddenly, the dark world below began to twinkle with campfires. Men cooked their meat. They forged bronze. They warmed their caves. They began to rise. Zeus looked down and saw the lights. His anger was cold and absolute. The theft was not just a property crime. It was a breach of the cosmic hierarchy. Zeus ordered his servants, Kratos, strength, and Bia, force, to seize Prometheus. They dragged him to the ends of the earth, to the desolate peaks of the Caucasus Mountains. There, the smith god Hephaestus, reluctant but obedient to his father, chained the Titan to the rock with unbreakable adamantine fetters. But chains were not enough. Zeus sent his royal eagle, the Aitos Dios. Every day, the great bird descended from the clouds. It tore open the Titan's abdomen and ate his liver. Every night, because Prometheus was immortal, the liver grew back. It was a cycle of eternal agony, a testament to the price of defying the Sky Father. For humanity, Zeus devised a more subtle punishment. He did not send a monster, he sent a gift. He ordered Hephaestus to mix earth and water and mold a maiden of stunning beauty. She was to be the beautiful evil, Kalon Kakon. Athena dressed her in silvery gowns. Aphrodite poured grace upon her head and cruel longing into her heart. Hermes gave her a bitch's mind and a thievish nature, as Hesiod bluntly puts it. Her name was Pandora, all gifts. Zeus sent her down to Epimetheus, the foolish brother of Prometheus. Despite Prometheus's warning never to accept a gift from Olympian Zeus, Epimetheus was charmed. He took her into his house. She brought with her a jar, pithos, mistranslated later as a box. The jar contained the gifts of Zeus, toil, sickness, grief, and vice. Driven by curiosity, Pandora lifted the lid. The evils flew out. They scattered to the four winds, invisible and silent, to plague humanity forever. Only one spirit remained trapped under the lip of the jar. Elpis. Hope. Zeus had successfully balanced the theft of fire. Men now had the technology to survive, but they had the suffering to make that survival a burden. Generations passed. The race of men degenerated. The golden age of Kronos was a distant memory. The Silver Age had passed. Now, the world was in the Bronze Age, a time of hardened hearts and war. Rumors reached Olympus that men had forgotten all piety. Zeus, disguised as a traveler, descended to the region of Arcadia to test the rumors. He arrived at the court of King Lycaon. The king was a savage man. To test if the guest was truly a god, Lycaon committed an atrocity. He took a hostage. Some say a Molossian prisoner, others say his own grandson, slit his throat and cooked the flesh. He served the human meat to Zeus at the dinner table. The reaction was instantaneous. Zeus realized the depth of human depravity. He overturned the table in disgust. His lightning flared, burning the palace to the ground. As Lycaon fled into the fields, Zeus cursed him. The king tried to speak, but only a howl came out. His skin turned to fur, his arms to legs. He became a wolf at the Lycos. This is the origin of the lycanthrope. But one wolf was not enough. Zeus returned to Olympus with a heavy heart. He convened the council of gods. "The whole race must go," he declared. "I will wash the slate clean." He did not use thunderbolts, for fear that the holy ether would catch fire. He used water. He colluded with his brother Poseidon. The winds were locked away, save for the south wind, which brings the rain. The clouds gathered, black and heavy. The sluice gates of the sky opened. On the earth, Poseidon struck the riverbanks with his trident. The rivers broke their bounds. The oceans rose. Ovid describes the scene in the Metamorphoses. The wolf swims among the sheep. The lion floats on the waves. Dolphins dart through the branches of oak trees. Towers are submerged. The birds, having nowhere to land, fall into the sea from exhaustion. The entire human race drowned. The noise of the cities was silenced by the rushing of waters. Only two survived. Deucalion, the son of Prometheus, and his wife. Pyrrha, the daughter of Epimetheus and Pandora. Warned by Prometheus, they had built a great chest, Larnax, and floated upon the waves for 9 days and 9 nights. They landed on the only peak that broke the surface of the water, Mount Parnassus. Zeus, seeing that these two were pious and just, held back the waters. He ordered the north wind to chase away the clouds. The sea retreated. The world was empty. Silence reigned. Deucalion and Pyrrha prayed to Themis, divine law. She told them to throw the bones of your mother behind you. Understanding the riddle, their mother is the earth, her bones are stones. They threw rocks over their shoulders. The stones thrown by Deucalion became men. The stones thrown by Pyrrha became women. A new race was born, the Stone People, a hardier, more resilient race, better suited to a hard world. Zeus watched from the drying peak of Olympus. He had punished, he had cleansed, and now he allowed life to begin again. He was the destroyer and the preserver. The boundary between God and man was now etched in water and stone. By the time of the Trojan War, Zeus was no longer the young revolutionary who had stormed Mount Othrys. He was ancient, settled, and weary. He was the Pater Familias, the All-Father, seated on the highest peak of Ida or Olympus, watching the intricate, bloody game of mortals below. The Iliad is not just a story of Achilles' rage. It is a portrait of Zeus's administration. The war began, in many ways, because of him. The earth was heavy with people, and Gaia had complained of the weight. The war was a mechanism of depopulation, but it was also a test of his authority over his own family. The Olympians were bitterly divided. Hera, Athena, and Poseidon hated Troy. Apollo, Artemis, and Ares supported it. Zeus alone stood in the middle. He was the arbiter. Throughout the conflict, Zeus held the golden scales of fate. This is the defining image of the mature Zeus. He is not ruled by whim. He is ruled by the balance. In Book 8 of the Iliad, he prohibits the other gods from interfering. To prove his supremacy, he challenges them. Hang a golden rope from heaven, and lay hold of it, all of you gods and goddesses, yet you could not drag Zeus from the sky to the ground. But if I were to pull, I could drag you up, earth and sea and all. He asserts his physical dominance, but he is bound by something stronger. Ananke, necessity. When Hector and Achilles finally meet for their duel, Zeus lifts the scales. He places the Hera, death lot, of Hector on one side and the Hera of Achilles on the other. Hector's side sinks toward the underworld. Zeus sighs. He does not cheer. He looks at Apollo, who has been protecting Hector, and nods. Apollo abandons the hero. Zeus accepts the verdict of the universe, even when it pains him. The most poignant moment of Zeus's life in the Iliad is the death of his son, Sarpedon. Sarpedon was the lord of the Lycians, a son of Zeus and Laodamia, or Europa in some myths. He was fighting for Troy. He was brave, pious, and beloved by his father. Zeus looked down and saw Patroclus advancing on Sarpedon. The king of gods felt a surge of paternal desperation. "Fate is evil for me," Zeus lamented to Hera. "My heart is divided. Shall I snatch him up alive and set him down in Lycia, or shall I let him be broken by Patroclus?" Hera, the strict constitutionalist of Olympus, turned to him with cold eyes. "Most dread son of Kronos, what a thing you have said! Do you wish to bring back a man who is mortal, long since doomed by his destiny, from the sounding death? Do it then, but not all the rest of us gods will approve. If you send Sarpedon home alive, be careful lest some other god also wishes to send his own dear son away from the war." Zeus listened. He looked at the other gods, Ares, Apollo, Hermes, all of whom had children or favorites on that field. If he broke the rules for his own son, the system would collapse. The hierarchy he had fought the Titans to establish was built on law, not favor. He made his choice. He sacrificed his heart to save his order. He did not save Sarpedon, but he did not let him pass unnoticed. The poet Homer tells us that Zeus shed bloody raindrops on the earth, honoring his dear son. A rain of blood fell on the Trojan plain, a physical manifestation of divine grief. Sarpedon died. Zeus sent sleep, Hypnos, and death, Thanatos, to carry the body home to Lycia for a proper burial. It was the act of a father who could not stop death, but could ensure dignity. The war ended as it was fated to end. Troy fell. The smoke rose to Olympus. The age of heroes was drawing to a close. Zeus remained. He had survived the prophecy of succession. He had swallowed Metis. He had birthed Athena. He had fathered the Fates. There was no son coming to overthrow him. The cycle of violence that began with Uranos and Kronos stopped with him. Why? Because Zeus was capable of change. He evolved from a storm god of raw violence into a political entity of justice and compromise. He learned to share power with his brothers. He learned to listen to the wisdom of Metis. He learned to bow to the scales of fate. The ancient texts do not give Zeus a death. The Nordic gods have Ragnarok. The Greek gods have eternity. But in a sense, the active interventionist Zeus fades as the age of man truly begins. He retreats to the highest ether. He becomes less of a character who seduces nymphs and throws bolts, and more of a distant, abstract principle of justice, Dike. He becomes the all-seeing. He sits on his golden throne, the eagle at his side, the thunderbolt resting at his feet. He looks down at the world we live in now, a world without monsters, without active gods, but a world that still fears the storm. When the sky turns black and the low rumble shakes the window panes, it is an echo of the Titanomachy. When the lightning illuminates the clouds, it is the shadow of the king. He is the beginning and the end of the mythological cycle. He is the storm that became a state. He is Zeus. Thank you for journeying with me through the ages, from the darkness of the Dictaean Cave to the golden peaks of Olympus, from the wars against the Titans to the judgment of mankind. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the complete life of Zeus, and if you found peace in the rhythm of the rain, please leave a like and subscribe to Hearths of Myths. May your skies be clear, may your wisdom be deep, and may you always find the light even in the darkest of storms. Sleep well.